appreciate you being here extra. It's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker today. The speaker today is Mojdeh Cox. Mojdeh is a Fanshawe grad. I have to get that in first. And she's also a graduate of Social Justice and Peace and Political Science at King's University College at Western. In terms of her qualities, she is a feminist, an activist, a working mother of 4 children, that I might add are 4 beautiful children, and a freelance writer who writes a blog called womenincolor.com, right? She's particularly interested in the intersectional nature of race, gender, and class inequality. And in her professional life, she is currently the Ontario Regional Representative for the Canadian Labour Congress. And she's got a wealth of information and thoughts to share with us today, so please join with me in giving a warm welcome to Mojdeh Cox.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Lorraine, and Amanda for both the invitation and the kind remarks. So, a little bit more about me. I don't want to focus too much. I am a local activist in the struggle for social justice and equity, and we're going to get into why I focus on that. Most of my work is around anti-racism and anti-oppression work. I frequently speak on these issues and provide public and community education on anti-oppression and anti-racism. I write for pleasure and sometimes as an act of resistance. I'm a regular contributor to Our Times magazine, which is Canada's only independent labor magazine that represents organized labor. I'm very privileged that my actual day job allows me to further execute my passions through working with the Canadian Labour Congress, and that is our federal labor body that represents over 3 million workers across Canada. I represent 8 communities across Ontario. Today I'm here to talk to you, and my presentation is called Race to Wellness. I want to talk about the impact of racism, systemic racism, on the individuals, on the oppressed health, on marginalized groups, and their health and well-being. Sorry, I forgot to. Moving along to talking about the impact of racism. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on our presentation today. Systemic racism is unique in the way it impacts communities, so we're going to talk about that. We will also demystify the differences between equity and equality, or vice versa. I will try to draw connections between the plight of Indigenous people and communities in color, in terms of the legacy that systemic racism has left behind and how systemic racism is upheld today. We will also identify white privilege yesterday and today and its legacy and how to respond to it. And lastly, we would look at how to be an ally and create positive, sustainable change. How can we be active agents of change even though we may or may not have privilege? So how to work together. So I want to first talk about the different layers of racism. I will provide an example for each. So when we're talking about cultural racism, we're talking about perhaps a religious headdress that is banned in a public place out of fear or out of ignorance. When we're talking about institutional racism, we might refer to deplorable living conditions on reserves that are perpetually ignored. When we're talking about personal racism or individual racism, we are referring to an example that just happened not too long ago that was in the media about a stage producer and an actor that was walking along Richmond Road only to come to London to present and produce and be involved in a live production on the life of Martin Luther King Jr. As he was walking down the street. He was called the N-word, and someone had shouted that out to him as he was walking along the sidewalk out of a car window. So these are the different aspects of racism and different layers of racism that people of color and Indigenous populations deal with on a regular basis. So let's break down systemic racism a little bit differently. When systems are set up to purposefully disadvantage groups of people, we get caught in a whirlwind of systems of oppression. And what I mean by that is that we have research, we've already have an abundance of statistics conducted both globally and locally that point to the disproportionate disadvantages that Indigenous populations and people of color face in terms of employment, income security or insecurity, housing, education, the justice system, and these are just to name a few. And all of the above ultimately take a toll over an individual's health and well-being, or a group's health or well-being. It's important to identify that systems don't exist because groups are not deserving of a better life, or that they don't have the motivation to do better. Indigenous people and people of color, in fact, have tremendous history that exemplifies self-sustainable, self-determined, and a rich existence prior to European intervention. Systems of oppression are not exploitative based on coincidence. They are actually quite deliberate. So allow me to paint just one picture of that. I think I got it. Nope, I don't. Bear with me a second here.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
The messages that they gave us, like we were heathens, we were pagans. My way of life was no good.
The residential school era in Canada was an era of gross human rights violations. Out of 1,300 children were reported, 1,300 children were reported in BC out of a residential school that were tested medically on various pharmaceutical ventures prior to them being formally allowed for the public to use. These tests, including the trauma, has had a tremendous impact on the victims and their families. Only recently, these revelations came to surface, and the government, we are actually placing pressure on the government, various activist groups, to allow for these records to be opened for the public for critique. Records that actually show and mark the violations of human rights on Aboriginal children. The legacy of residential schools, the abuse, isolation, and the act of separating Indigenous children from their identities are carried out today through child protection agencies across the country. Not to say that child protection doesn't serve the best interests of some of these children, but based on the video that we had just watched, we can say that out of all the children under protection, 50% are from Indigenous populations. That is an overrepresentation. The 60s scoop represents a period of time outside of the residential schools when Aboriginal children were apprehended by the masses. Not only were the children separated from their parents, they were separated from their siblings, they were also separated from their identities. 70% were placed with non-Aboriginal homes. In Manitoba today, there are reports of one newborn a day being apprehended from a downtown hospital. This is the era of the Millennium Scoop, and the struggle continues. Despite the history behind the poor health and mental health plaguing Aboriginal and First Nations communities, our healthcare system further victimizes them with blatant racism. Racist ideologies block Aboriginal and First Nation peoples to receive adequate preventative medical care and immediate treatment for conditions. A report released in 2013 by the Wellesley Institute says that First Nations and Indigenous peoples let me back up. A report released in 2013 by the Wellesley Institute called First Peoples Second-Class Treatment makes an illustration of the role racism plays in the health of Indigenous people. That report is available online. Beyond the gross acts of human rights violations and exploitation of slavery, the way the justice system has been used to oppress, suppress, exploit, and control the Black population is evident. And this is where we're going to move on to drawing some connections between the two experiences. Let's have a look at an American illustration of post-slavery oppression.
For a period of nearly 80 years between the Civil War and World War II, Black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today.
In one of the most shameful chapters of American history, generations of Black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
We Black people could be just picked up and put in jail. The sheriff department could sell people to corporations and coal mines.
He locked me up for 3 days. And after that, he said, if I don't go to work, he'll put me in the river down there.
People's lives were truly stolen from them. Their freedom was taken away.
All the southern states used the criminal justice system to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
These were real people who were deemed to be of no value. Maybe now, through the telling of this history, these individuals can receive some measure of justice.
The experiences of Black people in North America have many parallels with the Indigenous experience. And although Black people experience more extreme cases of oppression from systemic racism, there are parallels between their experiences and the experiences of non-Black people of color. One issue that has finally reemerged in mainstream dialogue around race and culture is the issue of racial profiling. Desmond Cole, through one very powerful piece, in the Torontonian captured the nation's attention around the issue of racial profiling and police carding. Since then, there has been mass mobilization around the issue of policing and communities of color and how to build on that relationship to be one that is healthy. Now, out of the issue of police carding and racial profiling, we have developed some mass movements across North America. Police carding and racial profiling has resulted not only in mass murders of Black people and other people of color, but has taken an extreme toll on health and mental health of people without being investigated on a particular, of people impacted. Carding is the act of being stopped by law enforcement without any investigation on a particular crime or being involved in any criminal activity. Individuals are, predominantly people of color, are stopped, ID'd, questioned, coerced, sometimes berated, and abused for no reason other than the color of their skin, which deems them to be suspicious of a possible crime. Routine checks have resulted in deaths. Minor criminal activity has resulted in murder by police. And so a movement was born from a cry out on Twitter by 2 young Black women in the US, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement. Racism can take a devastating toll on the mental health of these youth who fight for racial justice through grassroots movements. Marshall McCarroll, at age 23, just the other day, died by suicide, and some say as an act of resistance. So systems of oppression and injustice are upheld when people don't organize. Today, with Idle No More movement drawing attention to the plight of Indigenous people, Black Lives Matters that we just described as a grassroots groups advocating for people of color are all organized. Systems of oppression are also upheld with those with power and privilege who continue to benefit from these structures and don't push back. That's why being an ally effectively is important. So here we're going to talk about what being an ally means. To be an ally means to understand the issues first. This includes understanding your very own privilege, then using your privilege to make space for marginalized groups to have a voice. Further to that point, an ally uses their privilege to influence change. So this would be through policies, perception, and persistence. So let's talk about equity and equality. This is a great demonstration of what it looks like to evenly distribute the same resources to various groups and what the outcomes may be. Equity refers to the qualities of justness, fairness, impartiality, and even-handedness, while equality is about equal sharing and exact division. Equality equals quantity, whereas equity equals quality. Try saying that 5 times fast. It's important to remember that though. Equality equals quantity, whereas equity equals quality. And not to discount movements that talk about minimum incomes or an even sharing and distribution of resources. But if we're all not coming from the same stage, it isn't very fair in the outcome. So let's talk about privilege. Privilege is not something, and I'm going to give you a quote before I proceed, rather. So a quote states that privilege is not something I take, and which therefore have the option of not taking. It is something that society gives me, and unless I change the institutions which give it to me, they will continue to give it, and I will continue to have it, however noble or equal my intentions are. This comes from a white male who, and I can give you the resource at a later date, that he has written extensively on specifically white privilege, but breaks down spectrums of privilege amongst all people as well. White privilege is an institution, is an institutional set of advantages and or benefits granted to those who by race resemble the people who dominate the powerful positions in our institutions, like government, economics, and other decision-making bodies. One of the primary privileges is having greater access to power and resources than Indigenous people and people of color. Realizing this privilege may be difficult for some. That's the first and most difficult step. Because many of the 99%, many of who are reflected in this room, do not feel powerful personally. I challenge you to consider the structures around you. I challenge you to not feel guilty, but empowered by this realization. And I challenge you to push back. This is the beginning of being an ally. And being an ally has no end. It is in fact the act of joining in the continuous struggle for justice and equity. So it is a continuum. I'm going to leave you on that note. Again, I'm Mojdeh Cox. This was a briefer presentation. I whizzed right by this. There's one more last clip on the Toronto, several dates of action from the Toronto chapter of Black Lives Matters that I will show you. And I have then left some extra room for questions.
Get out of the car! And then I will light you up. Get out! Wow. Now! Wow. Get out of the car! You're about to break my wrist. Can you we are afraid for our son. We are afraid for our son.
that in London we are taking, we were one of the cities that were involved in a public consultation around police carding. I was in the room, there was about 100 people there, and with the exception of maybe 4 or 5 people who openly expressed their thoughts around the advantages and the value of carding, it was almost a near unanimous decision that this practice needed to stop, and that there wasn't enough data to back that the police force, in fact, themselves benefited from the act and the process. So the Allen Road closure that occurred, I believe, at late summer, early fall. Some of the clips are in the video that I just played, stem from the non-action around the Toronto consultations, and of course various acts of police brutality that were brought to the forefront in the media that were based out of Canada. So it is still a continuous struggle to address police carding, because it often is a precursor to people being subjected to brutality without in fact being involved in a crime. My personal interest in this matter stems from the fact that, as Lorraine mentioned, I am a mother of 4. My oldest son is a biracial boy who looks like he's much older than he is. He's taller than me and has a mustache. He's 13. And you know, he's a strong-looking boy, and he's still a kid at heart. But when he's out in public, my fears as a parent is, if these practices are okay, and it's legitimate to stop my son for the way that he looks, or that perhaps as a bias of something that is in him that may be feared by some, what would the outcome be? Will he come home for playing hoops at the basketball courts? So this is, again, a ripple effect of how damaging racism can be on individuals, families, and communities. I'll offer the floor up for any questions. I thank you again for your time. My information is up here, and I can be found both on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you.